Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, good morning to those of you on the East Coast of the United States. Good evening to those of you in Asia. For the people joining us around the world, thank you. I'm Michael Green. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a Professor and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. And we're delighted to have you join us for our annual Asia Forecast seminar. We've been doing this with the Asia team and our economics experts at CSIS every January in order to set up a discussion about what will matter in the coming year. We do some predictions. We include you, the audience. Normally, we would be doing this at CSIS in person. Obviously, we're doing it on Zoom now, but we'll use the same format if you've joined before, which is we will ask you, the audience, to vote on those issues and those individuals or those countries or those crises that are going to be newsmakers and set the trend for 2001. We'll have three different panels. I'm going to moderate the first panel on politics and leadership. And then the second panel will be moderated by Nick Cheney, our senior fellow for Japan and deputy director of the Japan Chair, looking at defense and security crises and hotspots in the region. And Matt Goodman will moderate the third panel on trade, economics, and finance. We have moderators for each of the panels, and they will introduce the panelists to you when we get to them. The way you vote on Zoom is pretty straightforward. We'll put up a poll. We'll have 4 or 5, 6 questions for each panel, and we'll ask you to choose, for example, what is the country that's most likely to face a security challenge? Where do we see economic growth? Multiple choice questions. You'll get to vote on the Zoom polling function. The question will come up in the middle of your computer screen, or if you're using a smartphone, it will fill the smartphone. And once you read through the question and respond, just choose one. This is multiple choice. You only get one answer, and click submit. These responses are entirely anonymous. What we'll show is the percentage of responses. We won't know who voted which way. And you'll be able to see the results on screen, as will our panel. So the moderator will turn to the panel after we've surveyed the audience to get their take on the same question and whether they think the audience has it right or wrong, or maybe, was interpreting this in ways that we should think about as we look at the political, security, and economic opportunities and challenges facing Asia and the US engagement of Asia over the coming year. We'll also take your questions. You can submit questions through the event page at csis.org. This is the event webpage at csis.org. And that won't be live, but we'll have our staff collating those questions we get through the website, sending them to the moderators, and then at the end of our survey and discussion of the audience, we'll go to specific questions from individuals. Please put your name if you want us to say who you are. Otherwise, you can keep it anonymous. So that's the plan. We have a lot to get to. There's a lot happening in the region. There's a lot happening in Washington with the new administration that has a very challenging and broad agenda, from dealing with domestic unity, coronavirus response, and economic recovery at home, to re-engaging key allies and international institutions abroad, strategic competition with China, climate change. It's a very, very broad and complicated and challenging agenda for the new Biden administration. We'll talk about that, but what we're really going to do is set the stage in the region and in trans-Pacific relations that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. So the first panel, I'm delighted to welcome to our Zoom stage, will address political leadership in the region. I'm going to be joined by Jude Blanchette, Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, a well-known expert on Chinese leadership, politics, ideology, published important books interpreting the Xi Jinping era. And we'll turn to him to help us understand political leadership trends in China and across the region. Rick Rossow, the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Studies, known to many of you for his work on Indian states, on the political economy of India, US-India relations. And Sumi Terry, who's a senior fellow with the Korea Chair at CSIS, widely cited and published expert, former intelligence official, and NSC official, particularly known for her probing analysis of developments in North Korea and on the Korean Peninsula more broadly. So welcome everyone, thank you. Let's put the first question up, which deals with political leadership in the region. And please vote. We encourage all of you out there to vote. It is anonymous. We will not contest the results, I promise. The first question is, in 2021, which of the following leaders will gain the most domestic power? Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, Yoshihide Suga, Moon Jae-in, Joko Widodo. We didn't put Joe Biden. He's going to have to share power with Congress and Supreme Court and our whole system of checks and balances. We're looking in the region. So please submit your answers. And when you're done, you'll have about 30 seconds. When you're done, click submit, choose only one, and then we'll see in a moment the percentage results on which of these leaders the audience felt is likely to gain the most domestic power within Asia. Okay, so the results are in. Xi Jinping, not surprisingly, won. Xi Jinping always wins. 75% of you said that Xi Jinping is most likely to gain the most domestic power. Of course, that's on the back of several years of significant consolidation of power. Some would argue the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong, or at least since Deng Xiaoping. Let's just take them in the order of the results, starting with Jude, as expected. Xi Jinping, powerful, but how powerful?
Well, if this was a central committee vote, we would certainly be hunting for the 25% that did not vote for Xi Jinping. But my first thought to the question was, is there any more domestic power for Xi Jinping to gain, given his unrivaled position? But I thought, when I was thinking about the question, I think it's important to remember that China has politics too. And this year particularly will be a challenging one for Xi Jinping personally. I like to think of this year as really being the kickoff for Xi Jinping's re-election campaign. Next year at the 20th Party Congress in the fall of 2022, he's going to be going for an unprecedented third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party, the chair of the Central Military Commission, and the president of the PRC. And what that means is he's got a lot riding on the next 18, 20 months going pretty smoothly. And if we think about the domestic TikTok of events for Xi, we've got the upcoming National People's Congress in March, where they'll unveil the 14th five-year plan. Crucially, we've got the 100th anniversary of the CCP on July 1st. That's no mere historical commemoration. That is the political event on the calendar this year and is the kickoff for Xi's re-election campaign. So he will be front and center of that event. So I would say I agree that this is likely to be a good year for Xi Jinping, but I think we should remember that he's got a lot riding on stability and ensuring that his image remains untarnished. And so that means he's going to be hypersensitive to external events. He's going to be hypersensitive to how the Biden administration is confronting and dealing with his administration, and critically, he's going to be hypersensitive to domestic events. And of course, we know from economics to social stability, there are a number of pressure points in China right now. So it's not necessarily all smooth sailing.
Are you surprised, Jude, at the somewhat, I'd say, riskier stance Xi Jinping has taken vis-a-vis the new Biden administration? The usual pattern when you have a new administration coming in is that Beijing is very careful to start the new relationship on a positive footing. But we've seen Beijing sanction 28 former US officials at senior levels, which sparked a very tough response from the incoming Biden team. Quite noticeable military exercises around Taiwan, in the Himalayas. This is not a cautious Xi Jinping. Is that because of the domestic calendar he faces politically, or is it just the way Xi Jinping rolls?
Yeah, I think there's just quickly, one thing we have to understand is this is wolf warrior diplomacy is not a bug of the system. It's a feature now. China sees, especially the past year or so, as being demonstrative proof that its political system is not just symbolically, but substantively superior to the United States. And it sees itself as really riding 2 decades of tailwind, wherein the United States is in a long, slow hegemonic decline, and China is now at the center of the world stage, or approaching the center of the world stage. So I think all of us as external observers here need to expect this to be the new behavior pattern of China, not some tactical aberration. And just very quickly, on a more problematic note, there is an iron law of autocracies wherein, as the leader becomes more powerful, he or she becomes more and more lonely. And the sort of, I think Kennan said it, the sort of obnoxious curtain of deference closes in around the leader. And so if we think of something a tactical mistake China made the other day in the sanctioning of the 28 outgoing officials from the US government, that got China nothing and ended up riling up the incoming administration for no good reason. We need to start, I think, putting in our calculus the idea that China is going to start making stupid mistakes as she becomes more and more powerful.
So Rick, Rossow, among the democracies, Modi comes out as the leader most likely to strengthen his domestic political position. Does that sound right to you?
I don't think. I didn't vote for Modi. I won't give up my vote, but it wasn't actually for Prime Minister Modi. When you think about Modi's ability to kind of consolidate power, you've got the formal channels and the informal channels. The formal channels are going to be pretty limited this year. There are only a handful of elections to the upper house of parliament, and most of those the BJP has no chance of putting people into. There's only a few state elections, and none of which, is the BJP really kind of a major player, although they would certainly like to be, particularly in the state of West Bengal, in the India's east coast. But so far, they haven't really shown a lot of political gains there. The only way that I think kind of the quantifiable tools of power that I think Modi might gain is when you look at the center state balance of power. During Modi's first term, he actually did a lot of work on devolving power to the states. He himself is a former state leader. So you saw critical steps like abolishing kind of the Soviet-style planning method where the central government would withhold funding to states if states didn't help meet certain targets for national development. Modi just voluntarily abolished this main tool they used to kind of beat states into submission, and a range of other steps to kind of empower states. But what they found is states in India oftentimes don't have the capacity to really sort of follow through on some of their own initiatives and targets there. So you do see some small steps where they're beginning to take power back away from states. And for instance, there's a draft bill right now for the central government to play a bigger role in managing states' setting of electric power tariffs and things like that. So there's some small steps where it looks like he may try to draw some power away from states. But for the most part, there aren't those quantifiable ways. But the less quantifiable way, Mike, you do see that all through COVID, and even though COVID has largely run through India, with barely any checks and balances, because things like social distancing in a country that's that tightly packed together, it really was more a dream than could ever be a reality. But yet his popularity rankings, despite the fact that you've got this raging COVID epidemic, probably the highest number of cases, most of those are unreported in the world, his popularity remains high. So if you presume that they begin to, the COVID burden begins to ease, economic growth begins to surge, then I think, his popularity as a leader among people will most likely only serve to move up in that fact. He's starting off the year, I think, with a bit of a political dent. Some long-awaited reforms on agriculture in India, farmers' protests, which really have hit another peak today. So for the first time, you see him climbing down on reform. So I do think that's one way he tends to gain. He's starting off the year pretty poor, only one way to go up, but up, and overall his popularity rankings in the country still remain pretty high.
So Yoshihide Suga in Japan, I think, came out next. The screen, I can't see the screen right now, which is okay, but Xi Jinping is very likely to be leader in a year when we do this, and so is Modi, although Indian politics can be fickle. Suga, there's a little bit more of a question mark. This week, for the first time, his polls went underwater. In some polls, his negative rating is now higher than his positive rating, which is not a place you want to be in a parliamentary system where the Diet or Westminster can vote you out if they think you're a liability. So there are questions about Suga's durability as leader starting to emerge. He's hitting big headwinds from COVID-19, which not only are hurting the Japanese economy, but have raised speculation the Olympics will be canceled, which would be just a devastating blow to morale in Japan and would have to affect any leader's standing. Suga has a big election he has to hold this year. As they say in Japanese politics, one step ahead is darkness. We'll see what happens. My own sense is if he stumbles and is forced to step down, I still think he's going to make it. But if he is forced to step down, the most likely people to replace him are people like former Foreign Minister Kishida, maybe Taro Kono, Georgetown grad and minister of almost everything right now. And they're not going to fundamentally change the trajectory, which Suga didn't change after Abe. The Abe strategy, Japan is not a polarized country like the US or India to some extent, or certainly Korea or Taiwan. So the general trajectory continues. The concern about political leadership in Japan is not about trajectory so much, it's about stability. And when Japan has long-term rule under a leader like Abe, or before that Koizumi, or back to Nakasone in the 80s, that's when Japan really shapes the environment, the alliance is strong. When Japan has a new prime minister every year, it's shaky, and that's a problem for the US. So it merits watching. Suga's had a bad week. I still think he'll make it and have a longer term government, but we'll have to watch. Moon Jae-in, people think he's pretty strong, but he's got elections coming up too.
Yes, he does. And, we have seen very dramatic decline in public support for President Moon and the ruling government, ruling party. And I think the most recent survey finds approval rating for President Moon has just recovered a little bit, but it's still low percentage range. It was in the 30s. I don't see him gaining domestic power or public approval the remainder of the year. There are obviously number of reasons for that. That has nothing to do with North Korea. There's a continued public resentment over what they see as, just government's inability to deal with some of its stated goals, right? Addressing socioeconomic inequality, taming corruption. The administration has been rocked by various scandals, including charges against one of his closest ally, Cho Guk, who was appointed as Minister of Justice last year and got fired in a month. And there's a whole host of domestic stuff, like a series of housing laws that backfired and only hurt the middle class and so on, while making little headway with North Korea, right? There's no progress on inter-Korea front. So the bottom line is, I think rather than gaining domestic power, there's the more likely scenario, as you said, is given the decline in public support for President Moon and the party, and there's elections coming up, the April 2021 by-elections, obviously next year, and then 2022 presidential election. This is the final year of a one-term 5-year presidency. I think there's a chance that he's just going to be a lame duck.
It is interesting, isn't it, but that he became a lame duck later than any of his predecessors. Korean presidents tend to become lame ducks about a year or two before this. It's pretty unforgiving politics. And people taking score should know that every year we ask this question, China always wins. It's a little bit of an uneven playing field because obviously Xi Jinping doesn't have to face elections or checks and balances the way Modi and Moon Jae-in and Suga do. And also Joe Biden does. So the next question is on the US leadership role and how it will be seen in the region, if you could put the poll up. So how will US leadership be perceived in Asia in 2021, particularly after the events of January 6th and the insurrectionist storming of the Capitol, poor handling of COVID-19 response, but also a new president and some expectations. So it's a mixed picture, and tell us what you think. Will the US see a strong reassertion of American leadership under the Biden administration? Will there be some residual anxiety because of US domestic polarization and pandemic response? But back on course generally, will there be a new source of anxiety in Asia because of uncertainty about Joe Biden's readiness to take on China? Or do we face the danger of severe de-alignment of allies and partners because of perceptions of American decline? This is the glass full, glass half empty, glass half full, glass completely empty range of options about American leadership in Asia. Interesting. So only 8%, and our audience, I should say, it's well over 1,000, I'm told. We don't know exactly where people are, unlike when we do these surveys in Washington, where over half the audience is American. We don't know in the survey result how many are from the region, how many are from Europe or the Middle East, where we do have some people participating despite the time difference. So not a lot of expectation of a strong reassertion of American leadership. The most common response is there will be some residual anxiety because of what the world saw with the pandemic response and January 6th. And you see, a little over a quarter think there is going to be anxiety about whether Biden can take on China. Why don't we start with you, Sue? We'll kind of go in reverse order, including how our adversaries see this. I don't know that they voted, but North Korea and others. Do you think that the new Biden administration puts our adversaries on guard? Do you think it reassures our allies? What do you think of the result you just saw from the audience?
Well, I think this is the most likely scenario. I agree that there will be some residual anxiety. Even though the Biden administration is off to a good start, I think our Asian allies are reassured by the appointments like Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Kirk Campbell, and so on. But I do think it will take more than a few months to restore confidence in U.S. leadership. If U.S., I think if we can end the COVID pandemic domestically ahead of other countries, perhaps it will do a lot to restore confidence in the US. But I think this threat of more populist politicians will continue to loom, right? Because the reality is some 70 million Americans didn't necessarily reject Trump's positions and after 4 years. And I think it's going to be just, so it's hard to shake off these concerns about populism and nationalism and anti-elitism and isolationism. I think this has kind of remained part of America, and I think there's concern about that. But I think for countries like South Korea, if the Biden administration acts quickly to restore or to resolve this burden sharing situation, I think that would help. I think regarding China issue, there's also anxiety about that. I think our South Korea and at least South Korea friends know that the center of gravity in US thinking about China has shifted, and the Biden administration has inherited fundamentally different US-China relationship. So there's awareness that US-China relationship will remain contentious. And so there's anxiety about the US-ROC alliance in that context of changing US-China relationship.
Jude, I really believe that the events of January 6th and the pandemic response shook some of our closest friends, Japan and others. But I agree with the poll result, no de-alignment. You're going to see most of our allies, and now especially Europe, which has been waiting for this, wanting more cooperation with the US, and especially on China. What worries me the most is how China has internalized this, and whether it might be contributing to even riskier behavior. How does the decision-making learning loop work in China? If they see the rest of the world not de-aligning and actually moving closer to the US, will they unlearn the bad lessons they seem to have learned from our response to COVID? Or is this going to be how the Chinese view the US for some time?
Yeah, this is not a tactical shift in how Beijing looks at the US. This is proof positive for the dialectical Marxists in Beijing, who see structural and inherent weaknesses in global capitalism and have looked at the United States since we entered the Iraq War as a slowly declining hegemon, of course, with periods of speed up like the global financial crisis. So I think this is, again, as you were saying in the first answer, they won't unlearn this, because this is both a conclusion that Beijing has to reach to be able to sleep soundly at night, and of course also I think we just have to be realistic here in the United States. There is a good core of how China is diagnosing the United States, which I think frankly is not incorrect. And to be, I think one of the biggest national security challenges we face in the US is jingoism, because we are in a position where leadership is not inherently given anymore. And I think it has to be re-earned by the United States. And so that to me is the great project here. Our first step is to increase our presence. Our second step is to then earn leadership. And I think earning leadership in a way that recognizes the balance of power has shifted in the world for reasons that aren't all about domestic atrophy in the United States, that are in a very good way about other countries, what we condescendingly call the rise of the rest. And that is something to be celebrated, but it also means the United States needs to start reconsidering its position in the world. And just what good leaders do, by the way, is they also delegate. And this is where the allies and partners position becomes absolutely critical here. We can neither afford nor should we necessarily be having the same forward-leaning security posture we had in 1985 or 1992 even. And so I think for me, the great project that I hope the Biden administration engages in is thinking about a global strategy as if reality matters. And we need to start looking at what the 21st century looks at. And final quick point here, when I was looking at the form of the question, I also hope instead of just looking at this blanket topic of US leadership, we need to also start thinking about leadership to do what? And that then brings up a whole set of secondary questions, like we need better understanding of if we're going to lead on a global integrated economic order, how do people think about a global integrated economic order? How are countries and citizens looking at the prospects for globalization? And so I think that second question of US leading what is another critical component of this.
I have a piece that I think is going on the CSIS website today for our global security publication each year on how Biden might be able to weave together the many, many things he intends to do into a coherent grand strategy. And it seems to me that the administration has a lot of the right ideas. People like Kurt Campbell and others leading on strategic competition with China, Kerry to do climate change, the Democracy Summit. But the essence of grand strategy is resolving contradictions in your objectives. And these are not naturally dovetailing objectives. And in the past, the Clinton administration in its first year, the Obama administration, Republican administrations, when you come in with a lot of things you promise to do, we often stumble in Asia. It takes about a year or two to kind of sort it out. Fighting with China over PNTR and Japan over trade in the early Clinton years. The Obama administration's initial attempt to create strategic reassurance with China and emphasize climate change. The US has had in the past the latitude to stumble and then recover. And what I argue in this piece is we don't now. And the key is what you said, I think, Jude. The administration's got to have the discipline to work these global issues like democracy, like climate change, through alliances and partnerships, and make sure that they reinforce partnerships and let other countries take the lead. Let's turn to the next question, the last one I'll do, which is on, I think, on democracy in the region, which is an important, the next one after this, please, Hannah. Democracy is a big theme for the Biden administration and a big concern. Freedom House has essentially said that we're losing ground on democracy worldwide. So the question is, which Asian country is likely to experience the greatest democratic backsliding in 2021? Because that will matter to the incoming Biden administration. We have a rich selection: Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, South Korea. And I'm going to ask Rick about India, which isn't on there, because there are some concerns about this in India as well. Okay, let's see what the result is. Philippines loses or wins, depending on perspective. So look, all over Southeast Asia, we've got challenges on democratic governance. This is one more reason, frankly, why, in my view, the Biden administration's proposal for a democracy summit is the right instinct, and emphasizing values right now is critical. But look at those countries. Thailand, the Philippines are US treaty allies. So how do you advance democratic governance in the context of strategic competition with China? It seems to me you got to have partners. Korea is respected in Southeast Asia for its democratization. Indonesia doesn't do democracy the way we would as a matter of foreign policy. but has something to say to other states in the region. So really have to think about how we build partnerships and alliances to frankly be a bit more humble about our own approach to some of these issues. So Rick, India's not on the list, but I do hear and you hear some grumbling about this. How do you see U.S.-India relations under Biden? Will it be a sticking point? Climate change is another one that complicates U.S.-India relations.
Well, climate change, I think, is going to be an area of good cooperation. You know, there's very few areas, I think, that Modi has really tried to go kind of beyond the electorate, but some of his commitments on climate change and renewable energy, you know, I think kind of fit in that bucket. So I think that's going to be an area that brings us back together. You know, I think most of the knocks against Modi and how he has comported himself, and some of, especially in the last couple of years, some of the more contentious issues that have been rolled out, it's not necessarily about eroding democracy per se. They haven't made changes to electoral processes, constitution. So, you know, unlike Venezuela and other countries where you did see real attempts to consolidate power by changing, you know, the actual structure and how the democracy works, you haven't seen in India. But you do see the government really kind of taking up some of these divisive social issues, particularly religious tolerance. And when you talk about, you know, potential challenges in the coming year on erosion of democracy, there's one issue that is kind of being, I would say, even more than rumored, which is would India create a national registry of citizens? A lot of Indian citizens don't have proper documentation on when they immigrated, on when and where they were born, things like that. And so if they do try to roll out a national registry of citizens, if it is up to individual officers to kind of assess whether documentation is sufficient to be given actual citizenship in the country, what happens to people that aren't? Is that going to be a tool that further impairs religious tolerance, and could people actually lose their voting rights? That's the area I'm going to watch for in India. So, you know, some of the other areas on you know, reduction in press freedoms and things like that have been well documented. It's a little bit tougher to say something critical of the government these days. They haven't done major legislative changes to consolidate power, but the registry of citizens, Mike, is the one thing I think we're all kind of keeping an eye on, and hopefully it's been pushed back. Hopefully COVID and economic recovery has pushed some of these divisive issues back as they try to focus on, you know, bringing jobs and bringing economic vibrance back.
A lot of good questions in the chat. We don't have a lot of time, but let me ask Sue one of these, which is a perennial, and I can't solve it, so over to you. A lot of questions about Japan, Korea. Do you think that a Biden administration will try to, quote unquote, fix the dysfunctional Japan-Korea relationship, which, you know, two critical, like-minded allies not working who are working at cross purposes in ways that help China and even help North Korea? Is there a way Biden can advance this? We know Trump didn't do much, but what do you think?
Well, I do think the Biden administration is going to prioritize trying to mend this relationship between Korea and Japan. We know even Tony Blinken, when he was Deputy Secretary of State under the Obama administration, he was focused on this issue. He kind of had everybody sit down, had these trilateral meetings, and kind of demanded concrete results. So it doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to be rosy. I think it's just too much history. It's too complicated, as you know, to just get it fixed like this. But I do think the Biden administration understands this and will prioritize the issue, and just make it a more regular thing to at least have trilateral meetings and force the issue, rather than, as you said, President Trump didn't do, kind of ignore the issue. So I think, you know, at least some prioritization. Hopefully
subtle, nuanced, behind the scenes. The last thing we want to do is get both Seoul and Tokyo mad at us. Jude, there are a couple of questions about Japan-China relations. The tone in Tokyo is less confrontational towards China. The tone in Beijing, at least rhetorically, seems somewhat less confrontational towards Japan, but on the ground, there's no improvement. So why don't you do the China half, and then I'll wrap up our panel with the Japan half of this equation, which is going to be important for the Biden team to manage as well.
Yeah, and if you look at how, you know, the sub-elite strategic thinkers in Beijing are talking about China-Japan right now, I think foremost in their mind is thwarting a possible united front approach. You know, they very much hear the line you just said that the Biden administration is talking about of allies, partners, allies, partners, allies, partners. And of course, Beijing understands well that in Northeast Asia, you know, the rocks in Japan are the critical linchpins there, along with Australia. And so you see Beijing's ability over, you know, really the past 70 years, despite, you know, underlying tensions with Japan, able to turn the dial and moderate. And I expect you're going to see a tactical moderation here from Beijing's side as they're trying to throw off the Biden administration. I think thwart some of these early efforts on United Front. But just final point, underlying that is right now, Rana Mitra has a great new book on this, but right now Beijing, it stokes the fires of nationalism right now. And a key linchpin of that nationalist narrative for Beijing is the Communist Party's war against aggression with Japan. So those tensions are very much at work here, but Beijing has shown an adaptability to tamp those down when it needs friendlier relationships with Tokyo.
About 2 years ago, Beijing dialed back some of the propaganda against Abe, but personally and against Japan. And Abe also tried to stabilize Japan-China relations because of interests in the Japanese business community and also within the LDP. People like Nikai-san and others became more important in his coalition management, and they wanted a more productive relationship with China. They're not pro-China, I would say, but they're interested in protecting Japan's business interests with China. So things calmed down a bit, but in opinion polls done by Genron NPO, there's a huge surge in the number of Chinese who thought relations with Japan had improved, and no change in the Japanese view of China because of what's happening in the East China Sea, and especially Hong Kong, which I think speaks to Japanese citizens in a way that's very profound, and Koreans. They can see themselves in Hong Kong. And so I think it's really, the Biden administration will be pushing on an open door with a lot of allies. My hope for the Biden administration is they understand that Japan has been competing with China for a long time, and there's a lot to be said for the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy Abe pioneered. All right, well, we had a lot of questions about hotspots and crises, and we're going to turn that over to the next panel. And I'm going to ask the moderator for that panel, Nick St. Cheney, to take the helm. Thank you all. Great discussion. And over to Nick.
Thank you, Dr. Green. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about some trends in regional security, and we're on the clock, so we're going to get started as soon as we can. But first, let me introduce our panelists. We're joined by Victor Cha, who's the Senior Advisor and Korea Chair at CSIS, also the Vice Dean for Faculty and Graduate Affairs, and D.S. Song, KF Professor of Government at Georgetown University. Next, we have Bonnie Glaser, Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the China Power Project at CSIS. And we're also joined by Greg Poling, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia and Director of our Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. We're going to try to get through as much as we can and tackle some of your questions which are coming in. So let's get started with question number 1. What % chance is there that China will use military force against Taiwan in 2021? Certainly a lot of concern about China-Taiwan tensions. We saw Chinese fighter jets entering Taiwan's ADIZ over the weekend. Some strong rhetoric out of Beijing. Also a lot of interest in how the Biden administration is going to signal support for Taiwan. So certainly a lot to tackle here. And let's see what you all think. Interesting. Under 20% wins our rapid fire multiple choice question. Bonnie, over to you. How do you see this unfolding in 2021?
Well, thank you, Nick. I'm glad that the majority of people, such a high percentage, did say under 20%. I think that's right. There certainly is a risk of accident with all of the air activity in particular. And the US has also had military aircraft in the area in the last couple of days. And of course, Taiwan's very close to the South China Sea. So we're seeing a lot of military assets by Chinese as well as American near the Taiwan Strait and as in the South China Sea. The Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier battle group has been there as well over the last couple of days. My guess is long planned, but those kind of regular operations will continue. So there's a risk of accident between China and Taiwan, but also between the US and China. I think that China needs to show resolve that it will defend its interests. And Jude in the prior panel talked about this year being the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, next year being a very critical National Party Congress for Xi Jinping, at which time he will become the third term he will enter into as General Secretary. So it's an important time for him. And of course, also for the Biden administration that wants to show resolve as well. I think that the Chinese are looking to impose costs on Taiwan and change the cost-benefit calculus of its leader, Tsai Ing-wen. They would also like to roll back US policy to some extent, which under the Trump administration, I think the Chinese found that there was an expansion of the definition of the one China policy and an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. So there's some signaling going on there, absolutely. But my view is that the Chinese are relatively confident Taiwan just cannot become de jure independent. And their top priority is to avoid, to deter independence. But reunification is a long-term goal. It's not urgent. Xi Jinping recognized that the costs are high. So certainly risk of accident, but the risks of the Chinese use of military force against Taiwan, I think is quite low, and I would say even lower than 20%.
Great. We have a couple of questions about Chinese capabilities for you. One relates to cyber, and another member of the audience is interested in your take on China's recently enacted law enabling the CCG to use force. And what do you think Chinese claimed waters means? So just quickly, China's capabilities, how do you see that?
Well, very briefly, China's capabilities are increasing across the board. And in the cyber realm, they have, of course, both defensive and offensive capabilities. Very significant. They use, of course, these capabilities against Taiwan frequently. And Taiwan, many people believe, is almost like a test bed for China's cyber capabilities, and in addition to disinformation. The second question regarding the Chinese Coast Guard, I think it's clear that the law itself is consistent with international practice, the use of force by law enforcement ships for specific purposes. And there are many countries that have such domestic laws. But the question here is how it will be implemented. And if we look at China's past practice, how they are using law enforcement vessels to control activities within the 9-dash line where they claim they have jurisdiction and historical rights, then I think we can expect that there will be a continuation, maybe even an uptick of some of those coercive Chinese activities by their Coast Guard ships. And the Chinese continue to churn out really, really large law enforcement vessels that are just so much bigger and capable. And of course, in terms of overall quantity, than any other claimant in the region. And so the ability of China to control the activities within countries, other countries, exclusive economic zones where they intersect with China's 9-dash line is definitely growing.
Thank you, Bonnie. Let's transition to US priorities for regional security with our second question. The top priority for the Pentagon in Asia in 2021 will be deployment of land-based ballistic missiles, improving command and control relationships with allies, increasing burden sharing by allies, countering China's A2AD strategy. Let's see where we come out on this question. Interesting. 59% improving command and control relationships with allies. I'd like to turn to Victor for his reaction. Of course, South Korea had a painful experience with burden sharing of late. But I'd be interested in your take, both in the context of the US-Korea alliance and more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Interesting response. Yes, it's true. I mean, we've been through a period with the alliance with Korea, at least, where it was very rocky over the past 4 years. Alliance that has many issues to work on, but it was really wrapped around two issues, and that was burden sharing and then the trade Section 232 investigations. I think there's an opportunity here for the Biden administration with all of its alliances, but particularly with Korea and Japan, to clear out the underbrush in the sense of trying to get burden sharing off the table, the dollars and cents part of this off the table, and focus on some of the larger challenges that they face. Command and control for Japan and Korea, I mean, it isn't as much of an issue. I mean, I think it certainly is an issue if we're talking about some sort of more integrated effort at missile defense. There are, South Korea has been a little bit difficult on some sort of more integrated and coordinated response on missile defense, on intelligence sharing. But overall, I was actually, maybe I'm not as Pentagon savvy as some of the folks in the audience, but I thought it was going to be more the last of those, which is countering A2AD.
Yeah, interesting. We had a question about U.S. withdrawal from the INF and how that might impact regional security if the U.S. were to deploy missiles at bases in the region. The CSIS did a survey last year on China policy. There's a report on our website called Mapping the Future of U.S.-China Policy, which I encourage everyone to check out. And we asked a question of U.S. national security experts, which capabilities would be most important for the U.S. And deploying missiles was actually lowest. Probably because of political sensitivities in the region. Interestingly, a lot of focus in line with what our audience thinks on strengthening command and control relationships. So while deploying missiles might be politically sensitive, that doesn't necessarily mean that the US isn't interested in allies developing their capabilities. And in the Japan context, the end of last year, the Suga government announced plans to invest in standoff capabilities. And I think more broadly, we're also seeing an encouraging trend of exercising with our allies and partners, with Australia, with India, in the Malabar, with the Quad, most recently Sea Dragon, Quad plus Canada. And I think those exercises are extremely important in signaling the strength of the alliance network and also getting to the importance of facilitating more interoperability with our allies and partners. Japan and the US quickly will have to negotiate a new agreement on host nation support, but I doubt that the Biden administration is going to use the same tactics of its predecessor, but we'll have to keep an eye on that in the coming weeks and months. All right, let's turn to question 3 on the South China Sea. Biden administration's immediate priority for the South China Sea will be to increase the number of US transits and FONOPs, deepen military relations with the Philippines, work with allies and partners to impose diplomatic or economic costs on Beijing, defend Southeast Asian oil and gas activity. All right, let's see where our audience came out on that question. Interesting. Impose diplomatic and economic costs. Greg, let's turn to you. How do you respond to this question, and also give us your sense of how the Biden administration might address issues in the South China Sea?
Thanks, Nick. I like the audience's answer. It's not the one I picked. I would have picked repair military relationships with the Philippines, but I think both of those have to be pursued in tandem. So, there are no purely military solutions to the South China Sea. If the goal of the administration is going to be defense of freedom of the seas writ large, and with it, U.S. credibility in Southeast Asia and the region more broadly, then ultimately the goal has to be to find some way to incentivize Beijing to soften its positions, dial down some of the coercion, and eventually make room for some kind of compromise with the Southeast Asian claimants that everybody can live with. And you're not going to do that with the Seventh Fleet. So finding ways to impose diplomatic and economic cost in a rational manner on Beijing that you can bring along a coalition of states, including the Europeans who have largely been absent from that effort. I think that's a huge part of this. At the same time, that's a long-term prospect. And if you look at what's happened over the last couple of years in the South China Sea, the Filipinos and Vietnamese, increasingly the Malaysians, are being squeezed out of their own waters day by day. You can't put in place a 10-year diplomatic strategy without pairing it with a short-term strategy focused on counter-coercion and deterrence. And that has to rest on the Philippines. I mean, at the end of the day, there's only one place in Southeast Asia where it's even politically conceivable to rotate U.S. forces for a China contingency, and that's the Philippines. If you look at all the other stuff that Indo-PACOM wants to do, including throwing back to the last question, all of this A2AD strategy, which if you look at the documents coming out of the Marine Corps in particular, are focused on ground-based missile assets, mostly cruise missiles, not ballistic missiles, but cruise missiles like Tomahawks that are now possible under INF. You still have a math problem. You can't range the Spratlys from Okinawa or Guam. So you've got to find a way to get into the Philippines. Everything about that strategy runs through the US-Philippine alliance. And at the moment, it's really on the ropes. The Duterte administration last year announced a unilateral abrogation of the US-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement, which would effectively undo the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that was negotiated by the Obama administration. It would also, I would argue, call into question the viability of our Article 5 commitment, because again, you can't defend the Philippines from Guam, so why continue to say that you're going to defend Philippine force in the South China Sea if the Filipinos won't grant you any access? That is still a problem that's facing the Biden administration. We've gotten a couple of reprieves, most recently, I think in late November. But unless a long-term solution is found, the US-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement is abrogated this August. So you've got a clock here. If you don't solve that problem, you don't solve the South China Sea.
Thank you, Greg. Bonnie, would you like to share your perspective on this?
I agree with Greg. I'd like to really just add one point, and that is, I think we only had 1% of the respondents say that the United States will defend Southeast Asian oil and gas activity. As in the Trump administration, the real shift in U.S. policy in the South China Sea was to continue and in fact increase freedom of navigation operations, but also to expand to condemning Chinese coercive activity in other countries' exclusive economic zones. And this not only affects oil and gas, but fish, because countries have exclusive rights to all of the resources in their EEZs. And so I think that if the Biden administration does not continue that, then that becomes potentially problematic in terms of U.S. The confidence of some of the countries in the region, including the Philippines and Vietnam, and probably, I defer to Greg, but I would say probably also Malaysia and Indonesia. The claimants, the other claimants, like this policy. They believe that just freedom of navigation is not sufficient to protect their interests. So I think it's a question mark whether this continues in terms of rhetoric, but also actions by the Biden administration. And I think that these Southeast Asian claimants are going to be paying attention to whether this remains high on the US agenda.
Related to signaling, we have a lot of questions about the regional summits scheduled for later this year, and what kind of message the Biden administration should send. Do you want to address that briefly, Bonnie? And Greg, I'll come back to you on that also.
I'll just be very brief. Of course, it begins with showing up. This is always important to attend the ASEAN Regional Forum and related meetings, the East Asia Summit. The Trump administration did not do a very good job, even when they were held virtually. And I'm quite confident that the Biden administration will do better in that regard. But of course, it's more than that. What I hear from Southeast Asians is that they want officials from the Biden administration to be good listeners, to understand that the region has evolved considerably in the last 4 years, to not just pick up where they left off, but to consult and understand what the priorities are of countries in the region, and then see what we can do in some of these multilateral settings. China has been very active in diplomacy in the region, and we have a lot of catching up to do. But I'm confident that the Biden administration is going to be on it when it comes to diplomacy.
Greg?
I think I agree with everything Bonnie said. Part of this, it's trite, but when it comes to ASEAN in particular, it's about showing up. And so going to the summit, which this year will be held in Brunei, which is likely to be feasible, at least partially, is going to be a big part of this. Appointing, senior diplomatic offices early, the ambassadors that were never filled, for instance, the ambassador to Singapore, the ambassador to the mission to ASEAN. Southeast Asians have been tired of hearing U.S. officials for the last 4 years say that ASEAN centrality matters, but not bothering to nominate ambassadors for the region. A big part of this is going to be coming to the region with a positive, not just a negative agenda. Yeah, everybody knows that we're going to come and talk about China. We're going to talk about competition and 5G and emerging tech and the South China Sea and the Mekong. We've also got to talk about COVID and vaccine diplomacy. We've got to talk about economic recovery and show that while everybody understands that politics is tough in Washington, especially for a Democratic president, you've got to have some kind of trade agenda for Asia. And I think part of it is also going to be recognizing that not everything has to run through ASEAN. It is okay to talk about some things in ASEAN and then walk across the hall and discuss the South China Sea with the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, or walk across the hall and talk about the Mekong with the Mekong countries. ASEAN centrality doesn't mean that ASEAN is the only venue to conduct diplomacy in Southeast Asia.
Nick, can I just add one quick point about this?
Sure.
I entirely agree with my colleagues. I think the one piece that I'm not certain of is how, even when it comes to security issues, how the climate change agenda is going to affect how the US is looking not just at China, but all of Asia. We can see from both the rhetoric, the signaling, and the appointments that they're making, and the level of the appointments that they're making of people who might be on the National Economic Council, but also have a lot of climate background, or John Kerry in this cabinet position in every NSC meeting. It seems to me like climate equities are going to be a part of almost every decision that's made in the NSC, even on security issues. And so that's, I think, a variable that has to be accounted for. Not exactly sure how it's going to play out with China. Maybe Bonnie has ideas on that, or with partners in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, thank you all. Multifaceted, and how will the Biden administration develop and define what Japan talks about frequently, which is a free and open Indo-Pacific. We'll have to watch that very closely. Finally, we can't have a panel about regional security without talking about North Korea. So let's go to question 4. Which of the following will Kim Jong-un most likely pursue in 2021? Summit with President Biden, nuclear test, missile test, working level talks on denuclearization. All right, let's see if our views of our audience align with what you've been writing and saying recently, Victor. Interesting. Missile test followed by nuclear test, maybe a summit, and little confidence in the prospects for working level talks. Victor, over to you. How do you see this evolving?
So I think I would agree with what the audience has said. I think a missile test is a foregone conclusion. Empirically, historically, they have done these things within a matter of a few weeks after a new president has come in. They did it with Trump. They did it with Obama. The North Korean leader's statements at the Workers' Party Congress in January made pretty clear that they are not, they're doubling down, if you will, on the nuclear program and the missile program, laying out a pretty ambitious agenda of everything from UAVs to hypersonic missiles to tactical nuclear weapons to solid fuel long-range ICBMs. So it doesn't seem at all like they're slowing down and that they have an agenda to speed up. I think when they see Biden, they associate him with strategic patience, the policy of the Obama administration, which they, did not like. I mean, if you remember the last year of the Obama administration and the first year of the Trump administration, I think they did almost 40 ballistic missile tests in those 2 years. The piece of this, again, that I think is unknown, and I wrote about this in the Post last week, is what COVID is doing inside the country, because they claim that they have no cases, but at the same time, they have sealed the border with China now for over a year. And I read something recently that said year-on-year trade with between China and North Korea was down something like 97% in October. And so COVID is having an effect on the North Korean economy. And, it may have survived 2020, but the real question is, can they stay sealed up like that for another year? Which is what they're probably looking at, because they stay shut down longer than the rest of the world does when it comes to pandemics, based on our sort of data and research on this. So that's another unknown, I think, even as the North Koreans double down on nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, to what extent COVID is going to be a source of instability inside the country is really unclear. And that really could be the black swan for the Biden administration more than another weapons test.
We're near the end of our time, but just in the context of networking alliance relationships, I'd be interested in your take on U.S., Japan, South Korea coordination and cooperation. Clearly an important piece, but difficult given political sensitivities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, if we're talking about the Asia portfolio, I think it's got to be one of the priorities of the Biden administration. I mean, clearly there's a big domestic agenda, but in terms of Asia, I think it's one of the priorities because it's important for the China policy, right? And it's important for climate change. It's important for a variety, North Korea, obviously. They have internalized this. A lot of these folks, Tony Blinken, Kurt Campbell, others, when Blinken was the deputy, he was doing these quarterly trilateral meetings to get a process going. So I would imagine they're not going to sort of go in there stomping their feet and banging the table, but I think quietly behind the scenes, they will make it a priority and will emphasize it to both allies.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we will certainly be analyzing these issues in great detail in the weeks ahead. Let me turn now to my colleague, Matthew Goodman, who will lead our discussion on economic issues in Asia.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Nick. Very interesting discussion, both of those panels, but as usual, we're saving the best for last, economics and trade. Glad those of you who are still with us are paying attention. This is an important set of issues, arguably among the most significant things that are going to be happening in 2021 or in the economics and trade sphere. So I'm going to waste no time and get straight to introducing our panelists, the usual terrific group. Stephanie Siegel, my colleague in the economics program, senior fellow here at CSIS. Bill Reich, who holds the Scholl Chair in International Business and one of our trade guys. And Scott Kennedy, who holds the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics. Again, all well known, I think, to this audience. So we're going to jump right in, and if we can put up the first question, please, which is our macro growth question. relative to expectations last fall, do you think economic growth in Asia this year will outperform, underperform, or align with forecasts? Straightforward question. At least the answers are easy to pick from. We will, in a second, obviously 2020 was a bad year almost all the way around. China was the only significant or major economy that grew last year, but most countries had a pretty severe setback. So the question is 2021, are we expecting better than previously expected or not? And it looks like a fairly even spread here, the kind of a close tie between aligning with forecasts and outperforming. So Stephanie, is that right?
Well, thanks for the question, Matt. I think as you started, I would kind of start from where are we coming from here, and just looking at the performance for 2020. So as you said, an awful year by all accounts, but with global growth contracting around 3.5% for 2020, it actually is considerably better than where we thought we were going to be in the fall. And I think that's mostly a reflection of the effectiveness of a massive policy response that we saw globally. So despite the health crisis and the public health measures that were put in place that really tamped down on growth, the outcome was not as bad as it could be. And that's significant when we're looking at 2021 and into 2022 as far as the outlook. I think it's important, as I mentioned before, because it speaks to the effectiveness of the policy response. And also because when we think about the outlook, there's been a lot of concern about scarring. So depending on how bad the economic collapse is and will be, the outlook depends very much on the number of bankruptcies that we have, on the accumulation of debt, on the ability of both corporate sector and households to actually start to spend once again when the pandemic itself is under control. So the fact that it was not as bad in 2020 is actually a good sign for 2021. And then the most important thing, as has been said since all of this started, is the economic outcome is going to depend on the health outcome. And so you hear there's still a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the outlook, and you hear a lot about the race between the virus evolution and vaccine effectiveness. So there's a race between getting the vaccine out there and getting enough of the population protected before the virus is mutating and impacting the effectiveness of that vaccine. So the outlook is going to be very much dependent on how quickly countries are able to get vaccines distributed and administered. And here I'll answer the question. I think when we look at Asia, the track record here on the public health response for many of the large economies in Asia has been among the world's best. So we can look at China, we look at Taiwan, we look at Korea, certainly. So I think taking those two things into account, kind of the effectiveness of the public health response, having faith in the economies and the governments of Asia to get vaccines out to populations, and a willingness to continue to support the economy through policy. In the meantime, I'm on the side of, I think we're going to see an outperformance into 2021.
Okay, excellent. And just let me, and if others on the panel want to jump in, they can, but just to say, I mean, to what extent China's growth, which is still not only grew at all in 2020, but looks like it's going to grow 8% plus according to the IMF in 2021. It seems like the pandemic is not a huge risk factor, obviously always a risk, but are there other risk factors with China? Because it seems like the region and the performance of the region overall is so dependent on China's growth. Other things to be watching in China.
Well, I think as you pointed out, China is the kind of singular large economy that continued to experience positive growth in 2020. So they are kind of well placed for 2021. But as we know, China is not a purely market-driven economy. And so it's hard to compare Chinese outlook versus truly market-driven economies. They're going to set a target whether explicit or not, for economic growth, and they will use policy levers to meet that target. I think the concern, even though they may achieve 7-8% growth in 2021, is the quality of that growth and the composition of that growth. Their recovery has been very investment dependent up to this point. And it's also relied very much on, again, external demand. So it feels very much like falling back to an old model of growth, as opposed to kind of a healthier, more sustainable version of growth that is domestic demand led and consumption driven. And that, I think, is the real challenge for China. And frankly, for the rest of the world, because we've seen China's trade surplus and current account surplus has actually been growing through this crisis. That is essentially taking demand away from the rest of the world. So I think the sustainability of that model, both for the health of China's economy, but the rest of the world willing to accept large surpluses from, the second largest economy in the world, I think could be problematic for China and for the world.
Okay, we are going to talk a little more about China in a number of dimensions, but Scott, did you want to add something to that? Or were you just—
Sure, thanks. Just very briefly, I'd say I'd agree with everything Stephanie said, and it feels a lot like 2007 in China right now in terms of their growth structure, composition, with a lot of investment and exports. The big difference, of course, is that China's currency is a lot stronger than it was back then. But this year, is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party. A year from now, Beijing will be hosting the Winter Olympics. They are not going to get through this year with numbers down. They are going to, even if it means more imbalanced growth, they are going to spend to try and address any weaknesses in their economy and keep it going, particularly on the consumption side. I'd say also, I think another outperformer is going to be Taiwan, which actually grew faster than China last year, 2.5%. And Taiwan's economy is really built for the type of challenges that we're facing. TSMC, everyone now depends on 50% return on profits last year. So those are two places where I expect to see outsized performance this year.
Okay, great. Before we get to the trade questions, let me just ask Stephanie one more question, because it came up. Somebody asked about debt in the last session, linking it to sort of military spending and things, but I think there's a broader question. How worried should we be about debt problems in Asia and globally in 2021?
Right. So this is the other side of that massive policy response that I mentioned. Is there is no free lunch. So we're spending right now appropriately, but we're deficit spending for the most part, and that's resulting in larger and larger debts. That's true in the U.S. That's true in Asia. That's true pretty much everywhere in the world. I would distinguish here between economies like the U.S., like Japan, like China, frankly, that have themselves reserve currencies and basically can afford that deficit spending, or have trapped domestic savings, which is the case with China, and other countries, many emerging market and low income countries that don't have that luxury. They also are taking on debt. They have been benefiting from these very accommodative kind of global financial conditions, but that could change. And that is very much the concern right now. So I am concerned about debt across the board, but I am very concerned about emerging market and low income country debts. And I think in order for those economies to recover, and not only that, for those countries to be able to handle the health crisis, they're going to have to be able to spend on public health. That's in their interest, but it's in our interest too. So I think we do need to think about solutions to deal with this debt overhang in those low-income countries in particular.
And I guess considering China is now a greater part of the international lending story, this is another area when people talk about areas where we need to engage with China on pandemics, on climate change, on debt as well, whether through the G20 or other means. We're gonna probably have to be talking to China about these issues as well, and getting them to be more transparent and forthcoming in how they manage these debts as well. Okay, let me just move on to the second question, and then we'll pull Bill into this as well. So this question is, will the U.S. signal an intention to join CPTPP? I guess the question is in 2021. Yes, no, and it will not offer an alternative regional trade strategy. U.S. will propose narrower sectoral agreements like digital trade instead. the U.S. fourthly will pursue bilateral FTAs with Asian nations that do not already have one with the U.S. So let us see how people vote on that. There have been other questions in the question chat, if people have had a chance to look at that, Bill and others, about RCEP, Japan's leadership, and so forth. So if you can wind those into that answer, Bill, as soon as we get the results here, which hopefully, here we go. So we have, it looks like a plurality voted for the U.S. Proposing narrower sectoral agreements on digital trade. Personally, I think that's right. We'll hear what Bill says. I voted yes. I think this is my my sticking my neck out on or standing out on a limb. I think before the end of the year, President Biden will indicate an intention long term to join CPTPP, but that doesn't mean we will start negotiations. So go ahead, Bill. You're muted, Bill. Yep.
Getting ready to do that, then I forgot. I voted yes also, but I have a feeling that the plurality here may be right if you confine the question to 2021. This is going to be a process, and it's going to take 2 or 3 years to conclude the process. But I think the script is fairly clear. The president's national security advisors are going to tell him we need to get back into CPTPP or TPP. I don't think we need to make a distinction right now between them. We need to do it for geopolitical reasons, to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to the region, for all the reasons that were presented by President Obama when he negotiated the agreement in the first place. None of that has changed. And I think the national security people will say that, you know, sending a few more ships through the South China Sea is not sufficient. You have to have an economic presence to demonstrate your commitment. The president's trade advisors, in contrast, are going to say, this is complicated and it's politically toxic and you need to be very careful. They're both right. This is why the president gets the big bucks to make a decision. But there's a script here that has been followed by other Democrats successfully. If you look at what Clinton did with NAFTA, what Obama did with Korea, what Pelosi did with USMCA, the script is always the same. You pronounce the existing agreement as not good enough. You say you're going to fix it. You launch a negotiation to do that. You make a few changes, and then you pronounce it fixed, and then you join. And I think that's the path that they're going to pursue. It's going to take them several years to get there. And I don't know that it's going to get off to a fast start. In fact, I'm confident it's not going to get off to a fast start at all, because the president's been clear that his short-term priorities are domestic anyway. But I think they get there. It's easy to talk about the path. There actually has to be a negotiation, though, and that actually has to have a conclusion that produces some, demonstrable changes that the president can label improvements. I think there are some obvious things that we'll look for, and I think they're not new. There were a number of things that were dropped from TPP when CPTPP was launched, and I think going back to those will be things on the U.S. priority list. There'll be some other things as well. Where I think the administration has not yet really thought deeply is that, to quote what Stephanie just said, as in debt, also in trade, there's no free lunch. And the United States may seek to rejoin at some point, and it will have demands. But the other countries are going to have demands too. We don't get back in for nothing. And I think we need to be prepared for the fact that other countries are going to come back and say, well, if you want in, then we're going to expect you to do the following things. And that might end up being a more difficult negotiation than people think.
And what about since the plurality did vote for sort of sectoral agreements, digital trade, what do you think the prospects are for, say, a big regional digital trade agreement? And, will the Biden folks what does that mean exactly, by the way?
Well, I think it depends on how you define the region. If you define the region as including China, then I think the prospects for that are remote. It's interesting that China's been talking about joining CPTPP. That's, I think, a clever PR move. It's very hard for me to see how they could they could possibly meet the standards that CPTPP requires without significant changes in their economy. Can you put together a broader agreement amongst other countries? Yes, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, the usual suspects that we've been talking about. I think that's possible. I think you can also look at the APEC model, which is to be very inclusive, but start modestly, and then over time, probably too long a period of time, build it up into something significant. They've done that on privacy issues, for example, and the fact that it's voluntary and limited allows people, I think, in some sense, to be braver about being willing to do it. And if you can follow an incremental approach over years, eventually you have something that's significant.
Okay, let me bring Scott and Stephanie into the conversation by doing this. Hannah, if we can put up the next two questions sequentially. So the next question, which is about US-China trade, if you can put that one up, and then as soon as we get the results, post those. What will happen in US-China trade relationship? Less confrontational path, outwardly less confrontational, but more intensively competing, including in institutions. Sharp rhetoric continues, but few new actions. So that's sort of a nothing choice, or aggressive Chinese actions.
You're not supposed to prejudice the outcome, Matt.
Sorry?
No editorials on the options.
All right, okay. So, okay, pick one of those, please. And while you are doing that, I don't know if Hannah, we have to do these one at a time, maybe. So why don't we see what the results of that are? But before anybody speaks, okay, so it seems like most people think the second option, that there will be outwardly less confrontational, but there'll still be a lot of competition for support with other countries. I think that's the right answer. But we'll hear from Scott in a second. Can you put up the next question too, which is somewhat related? Thanks. About decoupling. In 2021, US-China decoupling will continue, spread, decelerate, or cease to be an issue in bilateral relations. If you pick that, you're a brave person. Sorry, I'm not supposed to skew the result. And the first choice, is limited to technology, but continuing. Okay, so let us see if we can, how the results come up there. And then, yes, so we have continue, but more focused on the technology realm seems to be the majority answer. But some, a third of people think it's going to spread. So that's interesting. So Scott, why don't you take on both of those questions if you can? And well, go ahead and do that. And then I've got a follow-up question already for you. Go ahead.
Sure, Matt. And good to be with everybody today. And thanks for joining in. I think it really follows along from what Bill just said. But the Trump administration's key weakness on China and foreign policy generally was the conceit that we could use our market size as enough leverage to get the Chinese to move on big issues. And that just was wrong. A lot of folks told them in advance that was wrong. They didn't believe us. So they tried unilateralism in the trade war, and what they got was a watered down deal with China. They got some concessions on IP, non-tariff barriers in agriculture, financial market access. All were incremental reforms, the kind every other administration got without the same kind of rancor. They got the purchase deal, which was a total loser of a deal. So now I think the conclusion, Beijing's very stubborn. They believe in American declinism and their own, future success. And so it's very difficult to move them on our own. And so I think Trump eventually agreed, and that's why he shifted from pressure as a tactic to get a deal to pressure for pressure's sake and to push decoupling. I think what we're seeing from the Biden team, what they said during the campaign and during the transition and in the first few days of the administration, the big lesson is you cannot take on China alone. You, regardless of what you're aiming for, whether it's more cooperation or balancing against them, competing, you need greater cooperation with American allies. And so to revive and reform the liberal international order and to compete with China, I think is a huge underlying direction. And so China policy in 2021, I think, is actually going to be about allied policy. Figuring out, can we get allied on our general view on China and on the mix of cooperative and competitive tools. And I think it's going to be a data. We're going to be looking at export controls, investment screening, SOEs, all those things. I would agree also with Bill, it's going to be an uphill climb. US has alienated allies over the last several years. We've seen the EU come out with its policy touting strategic autonomy. There's also different views around the world about China. And China is very good at divide and conquer. And so we've seen that with their agreement with Europe and talking about TPP and having some current TPP members express real interest in China joining, even if that means before the US. So I'd say the big change that we're going to see this year on this front is that the effort to cooperate economically between the US and allies is going to shift from the US Trade Representative's office, which led the trilateral process with Japan and the EU, to the NSC and also the State Department. So I think we're going to see Secretary of State Tony Blinken, NSC advisor, National Security Advisor Sullivan, and Kurt Campbell spend much of their time not about directly engaging China, but engaging allies in Asia and Europe on China.
Okay. Do you want to say a word about decoupling? And my
Sure.
follow-up question was going to be not just our perspective on decoupling, but China's perspective on decoupling. And there was a speech or an article just overnight by a senior member of the Communist Party saying that they're going to double down on independence in technology and so
Sure.
forth. And
Sure.
their perspective as well as ours.
Yeah, I think I think the answer everyone gave in the survey is right. Is that we're still going to see us at loggerheads with the Chinese on technology, and broadly defined, I do think that this sense of sort of a nationalist view of the international economy and one's own economic growth and the risks one face is still extremely important. And in China, the lesson that they've learned is that the restraints that they've had all the time against the rest of the world, including the US, were important, and they need to build on them. And so we've just reinforced China's incentive structure to become more independent from the United States. This is something the Chinese came up with the word decoupling, and they are just continuing to work on that. And I think you're going to see concerns in the US, but I would say that if you look at the actual trends in economic interaction, there's less connectivity in tech, but we are more connected in finance than ever. The market cap of Chinese companies listed on NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange has doubled in the last year. Direct investment into China is larger than for any other country now, including US investment in China rose 4% last year. So I do think that there's particular risks, and we're going to still hear about decoupling, particularly from the Chinese side. But I expect under the Biden administration, we're going to hear more about risk mitigation, and not just decoupling as a tool of risk mitigation, but about trusted technology certification systems, resilient supply chains, other ways that we might be able to still manage these very serious risks without fully pulling the relationship apart at the seams.
Okay, Stephanie, do you want to offer thoughts on any of that? Quite a lot of ground to cover,
Sure.
but
Sure, no, I agree with what Scott just said there. The other thing I would add to that, he said that the change we're going to see is an approach that emphasizes working with allies, which I agree with 100%. I also think the change, hopeful change, but I think we will see it, is that this ad hoc approach to policy will not be what dictates specific action. So I think having a strategy, taking time to have that strategy. So I don't think we're going to see anything, in the next month. This is the new approach. I think there is going to be a well thought out strategy that looks at these different aspects that we've been talking about. So for sure, there's economic competition, but there are these national security issues. And we've just heard in the last two panels, the full range of issues that are essential to the US-China relationship. So you can't have kind of one-off policies without understanding how that fits into the overall objectives of US-China engagement. And I think that's critical for lots of reasons, but I think that's also critical for our own economic health, for the health of our private sector, frankly, because companies and allies need to understand what it is they're managing to and make long-term decisions on that basis. So that's, again, my hope, but I also expect that we'll see a much more kind of thoughtful, strategic approach that's going to take some time, but I think we will get there.
Okay, Bill, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I don't disagree with either Scott or Stephanie. I would just add, there's one thing that hasn't come up yet is this is an administration that is also going to be very focused on human rights. It's a values issue for the president and something that they care about deeply. And I think it's an issue where what we're going to see is China basically squandering a lot of its soft power. Repressive actions in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, aggressive actions in addition to in the South China Sea, bullying its trading partners, as we've seen with Australia and some other cases. These are things that make democracies very uncomfortable. And it makes them much more reluctant to engage. The market is attractive, but this is a significant negative force. And particularly companies that are in consumer-facing industries that have to worry about their image are constantly concerned about supply chains. And I think you're going to find them trimming and readjusting their supply chains to make sure that they do not involve companies that are engaged in, that are complicit in any of these Chinese activities. I think we may be underestimating that as an economic force going forward.
Yeah, I was going to make a somewhat similar point to your basic point here, that I think there is an opportunity for the US in the region with all the challenges we face because of China's, because people in the region want the Chinese market for sure, and particularly given Stephanie's growth projections and so forth, it's clear that the Chinese market is going to be critical to all of us in the broader region. But they don't want Chinese rules or Chinese behavior. And so that's the opportunity for us if we can position ourselves as offering a better form of rules, norms, behavior in many respects. That's why I think TPP is so critical, because for all its sins and for all its challenges domestically, and I don't underestimate those, I think it's critical for us to be able to position ourselves as offering something better. That's true of Belt and Road too. We have to offer Belt and Road. There were questions in the chat about this. Belt and Road is somewhat bogged down. It's not going away. It's going to have some successes, but clearly I think there's a bit of a retrenchment now, and there's an opportunity there for us, but we have to offer something better, I think. Can I just make one other point, which was touched on in a way echoes, well, a couple of things people said. People talk about cooperation versus competition. To me, it's important to stress that cooperation doesn't mean being soft. In order to get China to do what we need them to do on climate change, for example, we got to be tough with them. I mean, they got to stop, dirtying up their own environment with coal-fired power plants, stop financing fossil fuels-based plants overseas. And so there are going to be some really tough love conversations. So don't mistake, this notion of cooperation for somehow being soft on China. So I think of it more as, and Martin Wolf a few months ago, I often quote this, and I may be tired of hearing me say this, but he said, I think the Biden administration is going to take an engaged yet demanding approach to China. They are going to want to engage, but it's going to be demanding on a range of issues. So any final benedictions, because we're down to our last minute. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say Xi Jinping yesterday gave a speech to the World Economic Forum, not in Davos, of course, but from Zhongnanhai. And the key theme was he was criticizing the world's ideological criticism of China. I think, in fact, we're going to see a lot more of that ideological criticism. And in many places deserved. The Chinese have ideological prejudice about us, and with disinformation campaigns, economic coercion, and I think we're going to see ideological prejudice expressed in the other direction. But it doesn't mean that we can't figure out how to try and solve some problems I don't know if it'll be tough love or tough like or tough unlike to get there, but I do think we ought to expect this to have a conversation where values are much more out in front than they've been before.
Okay, great. 20 seconds, Bill or Stephanie. Anything final? Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something that Jude raised in the first panel. And that is, I think our negotiating position and our ability to influence outcomes will start with what we do here at home. And to kind of go back and state the obvious of what kind of sits over every discussion right now is dealing with the health situation here. But I think that demonstration effect is the kind of job number one, to be able to demonstrate that what we have on offer is actually appealing to the rest of the world.
Good. Bill?
I got nothing else.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. Best kind of benediction of all. Thank you all for your staying and listening to all three panels. Thanks to the panelists for joining me here. We're delighted to do this every year. It's one of the highlights of the year, and you can hold us accountable at the end of the year, or certainly when we do this again next year, for any of our predictions that you don't agree with. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we're happy to bilaterally to talk to any of you who I think can find us if you don't already know us. But with that, let me wrap it up and say thank you all. Everyone have a good day or a good night if you're in Asia. Take care.
Thank you.